I heard this story numerous times growing up from an old family friend, Nikki, as one of those life advice stories to keep in mind through the years. And to her credit, I've never forgotten it. Whenever I hear anything about hitchhiking, Nikki's story comes to mind, and it probably always will. Nikki grew up around the same time as my dad, so she was a young woman in her mid-20s during the early 80s. She is a truly kind-hearted soul, always willing to help others out in a time of need, and I can't imagine her being anything other than that when she was younger. She was driving into the city about an hour or so from town when she saw a man walking down the side of the road. As she approached, he turned and stuck out his thumb in a typical hitchhiker manner. Nikki, bless her heart, pulled over and asked if he needed help. He was really polite, if not a bit shy, as he asked her for a lift into the city. She gave him a smile and popped open the passenger door for the guy, who tossed his bag into the back seat and buckled up for the ride ahead. They shared pleasant conversations through the trip about friends, the news, and other happy small talk. She felt like they were getting along really well, and even bought him dinner at a pit stop halfway through the ride. She told me that he seemed really flustered and awkward when she paid for his meal, but one of the things that had come up during their conversation was money, and she felt for him when he said he was strapped for cash, which was the reason why he was hitchhiking in the first place. Eventually, he relented, and they went on their way. As soon as they got into the city, he thanked her profusely for the ride and the meal, and asked for her to drop him off downtown. Before he got out, he asked for Nikki's phone number so he could contact her someday to catch up. Thrilled at the prospect of checking in with her new best friend, Nikki excitedly wrote it down for him and drove off with the warm feeling of a good deed done. Now, I'm sorry if you were expecting something creepy to have happened by now, but I think this is what freaked me out so much as a kid. How nice everything seemed to work out. Nikki always gets this crease in her forehead and a funny look in her eye when she tells me the next part. About a week later, she got a phone call from her hitchhiker buddy. He barely let her get a word in edgewise after she answered before he told her that she should thank God she was raised so nice, because when he first got into her car, he was planning on raping and murdering her at that pit stop. He was going to steal her car and dump her body in a ditch down the road and then go on his way. But after she talked to him so kindly and treated him to dinner with a smile on her face, he couldn't bring himself to do it. He didn't think he could ever live with himself after doing that to someone so nice. He ended the call by pleading her to please, please never pick up another hitchhiker. Nikki never heard from him again, and when she tried redialing the number, she reached a payphone with no answer. I was a pretty brave person when I was younger, or maybe I just had that sense of invincibility that comes with youth. I survived some traumatic experiences as a child, including a stalker and growing up in a haunted house. I guess looking back, having been through all that made me feel like either I was invincible or I had gotten all the bad stuff out of the way and nothing else terrible could happen to me. Whatever it was, I certainly learned better after this experience. I didn't get my driver's license until I was 36, so when I was a teenager, I ended up walking most places, occasionally catching rides with friends, or, less frequently, hitchhiking. This particular night was one of those seldom occasions where I decided to hitchhike after working late and being too exhausted to walk. Most of the time when I was hitching a ride, I had a rule that I would never get in a car with a lone man. Only women, or men with a wife, girlfriend, or kids in the car. This night, though, cars were few and far between, and it was getting cold. To be perfectly frank, I sized up the guy who pulled over and figured I could take him if he tried anything, so I decided to get in. He was slender and had a strange frailness to him despite looking overall healthy. I told him my destination and we exchanged names as I warmed my fingers in front of the heating vent. He spoke quietly and asked some casual questions. Whether I was local and if I liked living in the area, things like that. He told me he had only been there for a couple of months, but found the town beautiful and hoped he could find happiness there. I found the way he worded this comment to be a bit odd, but I brushed it off. Soon enough, it started to snow, and the road quickly got slippery, so he slowed down and kept his eyes straight on the road, driving in silence. I was okay with that since small talk was never my forte. About 10 minutes later, though, I noticed a car at the intersection we were approaching that seemed to be sliding, so I warned him to watch out. He immediately hit the gas, shooting through the intersection, and shouted back at me, "Don't ever scream at me." I was taken aback. Before this, he had seemed so calm and friendly. I immediately felt unwelcomed and said, "Look, this is close enough, just pull over here and I can walk the rest of the way." He didn't seem to hear me, though. Richard, did you hear me? You can pull over here and let me out." No response. He continued staring straight ahead, driving faster now despite the snow. It's hard to describe the depth of fear that had taken over me at this point. I didn't know if it was safer to stay quiet or speak, but I was damn sure not to raise my voice after that outburst. After about a mile, he began to mumble something under his breath. I couldn't make out what he was saying, but I assumed he was speaking to me, so I told him I couldn't hear him. He continued to speak quietly and rapidly, saying things like, "You're always yelling at me. I've told him time and time again I don't appreciate being yelled at, but do you listen? No. Well, I'm done listening to you. Do you hear that?" I had no idea what to do. I had no idea how to respond or if I should even say anything at all. I even contemplated opening the door and jumping out of the car, but I quickly realized that the door handle was missing. There was just a silver-lined hole where it should have been. I started to cry and debate with myself about grabbing the wheel and steering us into an accident just to give myself the chance to escape. That's when he suddenly looked at me for the first time since I had gotten into the car. He blinked several times rapidly, then slowed the car down, pulling into a gas station. I didn't want to say anything to set him off, so I sat in silence, hoping he would unlock the door for me. After a minute or two, he quietly said, "I think I better let you out here." He hit the button to open up the locks, and I didn't hesitate for a second to jump out of the car. I was about to walk into the gas station when he called my name. I know I should have ignored him, but he looked so damn sad that I hesitated. He apologized and said he was sorry if he had frightened me. He promised he wouldn't have harmed me and asked if I would be able to get home okay. I said I would and closed the door behind me. As he was pulling out of the gas station, I noticed him stop suddenly. When I looked back over my shoulder, I saw him sitting there with his head down. I froze, wondering what the hell he was up to. I was about to run into the station when he opened his window and yelled to me, waving something in his hand. My hat. I had left it on a seat. I warily approached the side of his car, being careful not to get too close, but he simply handed it to me and apologized again. I didn't know what else to say, so I simply responded, "Thanks." I watched him drive off, making sure he was completely out of sight before heading home, so he couldn't see what direction I was walking. I ended up deciding to go to a friend's place instead to calm down. As I walked, I went to put my hat back on, and out fell a piece of paper. Folded into the paper was a $100 bill. The paper was a simple note from the man that said, "I'm sorry, please take a cab home and don't hitchhike anymore tonight." I didn't. In fact, that was the last time I ever hitched a ride alone. At the time of this story, I was a 20-year-old newlywed. When my husband and I got married, I moved to the small town where he was living, which was pretty convenient since we both worked in the nearby major city. I grew up as the youngest of 3 siblings who were a lot older than me, and as a result, I was spoiled rotten. This meant that when I got married, in addition to getting used to my stressful full-time job, I also had to get accustomed to coming home and cleaning the house, cooking, and doing laundry. Even though I was happily married, I was kind of tired all the time then. I also had encountered a lot of creepy men throughout my childhood, and since I was so tired all the time, I didn't pick up on the fact that something was seriously wrong throughout this experience. One Saturday while my husband and I were driving around, we saw a guy on the side of the road hitchhiking. I had always been taught not to pick up hitchhikers, so I was a bit freaked out when my husband pulled over and picked him up. The guy ended up seeming okay though, and he bonded with my husband over their similar taste in music. They ended up becoming friends, and soon enough, the hitchhiker, Will, became a regular visitor at our apartment. There were many nights where I went to bed and they were still up playing guitars and hanging out. Will wasn't a bad-looking dude either. Long, dark brown hair, tan, and muscular. For some reason, this made me feel a little more comfortable with him, and neither me or my husband ever questioned the fact that he lived with his grandmother and didn't have a job, or even seemed interested in getting one. After a while of living together, my parents let us know that they had an empty house available in my hometown and offered for us to live there for free. It was just as close to the major city where my husband and I worked, so we jumped at the opportunity and quickly said our goodbyes to Will and our other friends in the area. After living back home for a couple of months, my husband came home from work one day to find Will passed out drunk in a lawn chair in our yard. This was the first time we had seen or heard from him since we moved, which was definitely a bit odd, but I guess my husband was just excited to have his friend around again. When I arrived home from work that day, my husband and Will were playing guitars and having a few drinks. It was a Friday night, so I stayed up a bit later than usual to catch up with Will. At some point during the night, Will told us about how he'd been present during a murder just a few days before. It was really strange. He told us about it in such a matter-of-fact kind of way, with no emotion whatsoever. He told us he had went swimming at a local lake with two of his older friends, and the other two men got into an argument and ended up getting into a fight. One ended up beating the other to death with a shovel. He said he could hear the sound of the shovel making a pinging noise as he ran to get help. I guess if I hadn't been so tired, young, and naive, I would have been a lot more creeped out by this story. Later on in the evening, Will tried to get me to have a drink with him and my husband. I never really liked alcohol much, so I turned him down. He ended up getting frustrated, and after a few declined offers, he held my head back and tried to force me to drink. He did end up getting some of his drink down my throat before I managed to shove him off. My husband did not react well and got on his case about it a bit. I decided it was time for me to go to bed at that point and let them have their guy time without me around. Since I was so exhausted by that time of night, I fell into a deep sleep as soon as my head hit the pillow. I woke up the following morning around 6 a.m. to find my husband sitting on the bed, with his back leaning up against the headboard. He was wide awake and looked extremely alert and intent, as if he was listening out for something. He told me he had been awake all night, and I was immediately concerned when I noticed his knife at the bedside table. My husband never did tell me exactly what transpired during the night after I fell asleep, but he did reveal to me that he was worried Will might try to kill him in his sleep, which is why he sat up all night, waiting and watching. He told me he believed Will was actually the one who committed the murder he had told us about. He also thought Will was trying to get me drunk so I would sleep soundly while he finished him off, just so that Will and I could be together. The idea that Will was interested in me like that at all was a complete shock to me, but I believed my husband. He was not the paranoid type, nor was he ever jealous or suspicious, so I knew Will must have done something to justify this fear. Will slept on our couch that night, and come morning, he was back to being the Will we were all familiar with. He was acting like my husband's buddy again, but he ended up taking Will down the road pretty quickly so he could hitchhike home. Will never came to our house again after that. I think he realized he had outworn his welcome. A few years later, my husband was working at a convenience store to supplement our income, and Will came in one night. He didn't seem to remember my husband, but he was drunk and acting strange. We took this as confirmation that we were lucky Will was no longer in our lives, and we never picked up another hitchhiker again. When my aunt was a teenager back in the 70s, she and a few friends decided to skip school one day. They wanted to go across town, which takes hours by foot because they lived in a rural area and none of them had a car at the time. Being young and naive, my aunt and her friends decided to hitchhike. After a while of walking around trying to flag down cars, a man stopped to pick them up. My aunt said the man was very handsome and had a great smile. He was as sweet as can be, so she and her friends didn't even hesitate to get in the car. He drove them to their destination, gave them a smile and nod, and continued on his way. I'm not sure how much time passed after that, but she told me she was watching the news one afternoon and noticed a familiar face. It was the man who had given her and her friends a lift home. He had been arrested for raping and murdering a large number of young women around her age. His name was Ted Bundy. Needless to say, my aunt never hitchhiked again. Even though this happened about 5 years ago, this whole experience is burned pretty intensely in my mind, so I remember it quite well. I'm a 26-year-old man, so I was around 21 when this event occurred. I was living in southern Ohio at the time, about 45 minutes away from Cincinnati. I was attending a small college in the area and lived pretty isolated from most of my friends and family during the week. My friends had all went to their various colleges of choice throughout the Midwest, and my family remained in my hometown, so I was pretty much on my own. I ended up at this school alone because I had a pretty specific major, and this was one of the very few colleges in the country that would accommodate me. Luckily, my girlfriend went to a college fairly close, so I found myself making 2 or 3 trips a week to hang out and study with her. On most weekends, I would go on road trips to visit my friends since their campuses were a lot bigger and way more fun than my small-town college. During this particular weekend, I was getting ready to drive about 2 hours to visit my friend Kyle at school. I had made the same trip about 30 times before this, so I knew the route pretty well and didn't even need to use my GPS to get there. I left on Friday afternoon when I finished with my classes for the day and was set to arrive at his dorm around 8 p.m., right on time to head out for a night of binge drinking and eating garbage food. Oh, the joys of college. I set off at about 10 of 6 and was roughly 15 minutes into my trip when I got a call from my girlfriend. I had let her know I was going to be heading to Kyle's, so I was a bit surprised she was calling and figured something must be wrong. I answered quickly and listened to her tell me about how she was working that night and her car had broken down in her dorm parking lot when she was trying to leave for her shift. She figured I wasn't too far into my trip, so she was calling to see if I could give her a quick ride to work before I got too far away. Being the dutiful boyfriend that I was, I agreed and immediately set off on the 20-minute drive to her place. I was pretty far off campus at this point, though, so I pulled my car over on the highway and checked my GPS to see if there was a faster route. The map on my phone revealed that there was an exit coming up that would get me to a side street to take me there fairly quickly, so I texted her to let her know I was on my way and started off towards my new destination. I had seen this exit plenty of times, but had never had any reason to go off on it, so once I exited the highway, my surroundings were completely unfamiliar. The exit took me off onto a road with dense woods on the right side and a highway on the left. My phone informed me that my next turn wasn't coming up for another 5 miles, so I had a ways to go before I had to do any navigating. About half a mile later, the road turned and there were now trees surrounding me on both sides. To be honest, it was a really beautiful sight. It was October, so the surrounding woods were a mix of warm colors, and I was really enjoying my detour. There was only an occasional break in the tree line for a driveway and a mailbox to poke out. The houses were hard to see through the dense woods, but from the few glances I did get, they looked really nice. It was starting to get a little dark, and I had another mile to go before my turn when I noticed a Toyota with the hood popped further down the road. As I approached, I saw a man in a shirt and tie with his head under the hood, inspecting his broken-down car. There wasn't any traffic behind me, so I stopped for a moment to ask if everything was okay and if he needed to borrow my phone or anything. He didn't seem to hear me at first, so a little louder this time I said, "Everything okay?" This time he lifted his head away from the engine and looked up at me. He seemed like a completely normal guy. Short brown hair, brown eyes, and a bit of a 5 o'clock shadow. He smiled and told me he was on his way home from work when something went wrong with his engine. I offered to let him borrow my phone, just in case he needed to call anyone to pick him up or to get the car towed, but he replied, "Oh no, that's okay, I have a car service that will come get the car for me. They're closed until tomorrow morning though, so I hate to ask you this, but could you possibly give me a ride to my brother's house? He only lives like 4 minutes away from here." That absolutely should have been a red flag for me, but I guess I was so concentrated on how normal this guy seemed that I didn't think much of it. Looking back though, why couldn't he have used my phone to call his brother? And if it was really only a 4-minute drive, why couldn't he walk there? Of course, hindsight is 20/20, and I'm now well aware that I made a bad decision that night. I was physically much bigger than him, and he was driving a nice car, and he didn't seem like a weirdo or a crazy person, so I agreed to give him a quick ride to his brother's house since it was on the way. I figured, if anything, I could overpower him if need be. I unlocked the door for him to get in, and he pointed me in the direction of his brother's house, so we set off on our way. Things seemed pretty normal for the first few minutes, and I really felt like I had done the right thing. It didn't take long before things started to get weird, though. The first thing that made me uncomfortable was the way he would react whenever a swear came up in the music I was listening to. He almost flinched every time 50 Cent said fuck or bitch. I picked up on this pretty quickly, so I changed the song, thinking he might just be really against swearing or something. About a minute after I changed the song, though, he reached up and slammed his hand on the radio power button to turn it off. He didn't hit it crazy hard or anything, but it was definitely enough to get me to notice. I tried to make light of the situation and said, "Hey, not your style?" My question was met with complete silence, though. At this point, I was more than ready to get this guy out of my car, so I asked him how much further down the road we had to go, letting him know I had somewhere to be so I couldn't be late. He said we had about 4 minutes to go, which immediately sent up warning signs in my head. He said the same thing about 8 minutes ago. I decided that was enough. I didn't think he was dangerous or anything, but it seemed like he was lying about how far his destination was so that I wouldn't deny him a ride. It was getting late, and I wasn't trying to face my girlfriend's wrath, so I told him that was as far as I could take him, and he was going to have to walk the rest of the way. His mood changed immediately, but instead of getting angry, which I was kind of expecting, he started to panic and was practically begging me to take him the rest of the way. He was completely overreacting, which set off every alarm I had in my head. I told him to remove himself from my car before I had to do it myself. It was at this point that he pulled out his oversized wallet and offered to pay me to take him the rest of the way. He tried to pull out a stack of $20 bills, but as he removed them from his wallet, something else fell out on the seat next to him. It was only a split second before he shoved it back into his pocket, but I got a good enough look at it for it to haunt me to this day. Along with his money, a small Ziploc bag of what I'm confident were adult teeth fell out of his wallet. Front teeth, molars, you name it. Everyone I've told this story to has been skeptical of this part, but I know what I saw. I freaked out worse than I ever had in my entire life and screamed at him to get out of my car. He got out immediately and looked at me with surprised eyes as I left him on the side of the road. I took off and called the police, but they simply told me not to pick up hitchhikers ever again and that they couldn't do anything since the man technically didn't commit any crimes. I still don't know where he was going or what his plans were, and frankly, I'm glad I don't. I do know, however, that he seemed to have all his own teeth in his mouth.